had a tumultuous 2 years over the last, since 2011 and the overthrow of Ben Ali in Tunisia and Mubarak in Egypt. I think these 2 years very much relate to the discussion yesterday in three senses. Firstly, we see that the uprisings and the ongoing struggles in the region, the Middle East, are very much related to the global economic crisis. They are in many ways a reflection of this crisis and its reverberation in the Middle East and North Africa. Secondly, clearly the significance of imperialist intervention, and of course British imperialist intervention in the Middle East, relates centrally to our politics and the question of anti-imperialism, anti-racist struggles. And thirdly, the notions of solidarity, I think, particularly the question of solidarity with those struggling against the crisis in Europe, Southern Europe, Greece, Spain, Portugal, because of its proximity to the region. I think on those three levels, this discussion bears importance to the discussions we had yesterday. What I wanted to do, and I'm not going to be able to cover everything in this pre-conference discussion that is contained in the bulletin, but the aim of this piece is to look more closely at the uprising and specifically how it relates to the question of Palestine and the events that are ongoing in Palestine, but particularly beyond the invasion of the Gaza Strip, the bombing of the Gaza Strip in 2012. I wanted to begin by setting this discussion in the framework of the region as a whole, looking at some of the changes that have developed in the Middle East and the politics of the Middle East as a whole. Then turn to the uprisings themselves, some of the causes of the uprisings. I'm not going to be able to go into detail, of course, of the uprisings in specific national contexts, but in general the causes of the uprisings, then turn to Palestine, and then finally the tasks I think that we can talk about from the perspective of SR. To begin with the general orientation, or our general orientation of the politics of the Middle East, I think there's three factors that we need to always keep in mind when we're talking about the region. The first of these is that the Middle East continues to be one of the most important zones in the capitalist world market. This is principally due to, of course, the presence of large quantities of oil, equivalent to 1/4 of the world's oil production. But also, we need to remember, alongside of this oil comes an enormous amount of petrodollars, financial surpluses that come through the sale of these hydrocarbons. So in the context of a deepening global crisis and a weakening of US economic hegemony, the Middle East really does confer an enormous strategic power to those who can dominate it. So I think that's the first point that we always need to keep in mind. The Middle East remains a zone of enormous power for those imperialist states that can dominate the region. The second thing is, because of this central strategic significance, that there is a constant struggle between different powers over domination of the region. This is true, of course. The United States has been the principal power since the Second World War, but we can see its rivalries with Europe, as well as emerging powers such as China and Russia. Okay, so there is a struggle between these powers over who will be dominant. And I think this struggle points to one issue that we should always keep in mind, that the wars that we see across the Middle East are very much a single war. We can't separate out the question of Palestine from the question of Afghanistan, from the question of Iraq, from North Africa and so forth. But we need to see this in the context of a permanent single war. And I think there's a problem in much of the anti-war movement globally to try and pick the good and bad wars. But I think we need to emphasize completely that there is this single war that is a permanent feature of the region. Thirdly, the single war doesn't mean that we should see the region, the Middle East, as just being pawns on a chessboard that are being somehow manipulated or only subject to imperialist domination. The other side to this, of course, is that the peoples of the Middle East are in constant struggle, and there is a unanimity of interest from the perspective of imperialism, that the region should remain under domination. So the worst possible scenario, I think, from the perspective of all global powers, and here I'm also speaking about China, Russia, and emerging powers, is that the Middle East, that we could see in the region a successful struggle that overthrows these patterns of domination that have been established since the Second World War. So these three factors. One, the region is of immense importance for the questions of oil, financial surpluses. Two, we have this ongoing struggle between imperialist powers to dominate the region. And three, that there is at the same time a struggle from the region itself against imperialism that unites to a certain extent the interests of imperialism despite their specific rivalries. Obviously, since the Second World War, the strategic domination of the region has been developed and led by the United States as the leading power of global capitalism. There are three aspects, I think, or three pillars, if you like, to how the United States has managed to maintain its control over the Middle East. Firstly, we see the alliance with Israel as being central to this, particularly since the 1967 war, and that alliance is ongoing. We can talk, perhaps in discussion, a bit more about the nuances to this, but I think we can certainly say the United States relies and continues to rely upon Israel as a principal ally in the region. The second long-standing military and political alliance has been with the states of the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC. The six monarchies in the Gulf region, the region where we see the oil largely present. This again has been a long-standing alliance, particularly with Saudi Arabia, since the end of the Second World War, and Britain has played a very important role in this, okay? Particularly with states like the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, these states where Britain plays a particularly significant role in how imperialism looks and dominates the region. The third aspect to the way the United States has controlled the Middle East has been through its financial and political and military support of proxy states like, in particular, Egypt under Mubarak and the Hashemite monarchy in Jordan. These alliances are less stable from the perspective of imperialism than the first two pillars I outlined, Israel and the Gulf states, because they're always under threat to some kind of revolution from below. So I think that's one aspect, of course, of the uprisings that we've seen over the last couple of years. So these alliances, these three alliances, particularly since the 2000s, the United States has attempted to link or knit these three pillars together. Through various trade, financial agreements, through political agreements, attempting to normalize the relationship between Israel and the rest of the Arab world, to see a greater role for the Gulf states in the politics of the region, and within this to support these proxy regimes. Now, the movements of 2011 and 12 have profoundly shaken up this structure of US domination. It has, of course, forced the departure of people like Mubarak and Tunisia's Ben Ali. The Gulf states themselves have faced major revolts, and we should always remember this, particularly, of course, the revolt in Bahrain. But other states, Saudi Arabia, Oman, have also seen domestic revolts. Israel remains isolated, and its integration into the Middle East remains opposed by the vast majority of the Arab world. Now, I don't have time to go into too much detail on the roots of these revolts, and this is something we've discussed, I think, in other settings. But I want to point out that it's very important we see the causes of the uprisings as not just being a question of dictatorship or autocratic regimes. The kind of changes that we've seen under the neoliberal period in the Middle East have produced profound social transformations in the Middle East, and the policies that we're very familiar with of privatization, deregulation of labor markets, opening up to foreign investment, free trade agreements, and so forth, have really transformed the entire region, from across North Africa through the Mediterranean and the Gulf region as well. These neoliberal processes are deeply bound up with the authoritarian states in the area. Mubarak, Ben Ali in particular were held up as poster childs for neoliberal reform. Their authoritarian practices were the midwife of neoliberal transformation in the Middle East. So when the kind of dominant rhetoric that sees the Middle East or the revolts as being a question of, democracy, too much authoritarianism, is false, because it separates the politics from the economics. We need to see the political and economic factors as really being intertwined. These were as much a struggle for or against neoliberalism as they were against dictatorships, and that continues to be true. The other factor, is that 10 minutes left? Or, yeah. The other factor to this is the way that the neoliberal reform over the last decade or so has transformed the way the region itself is connected. And this is something I really want to emphasize. What has happened with the processes of privatization and liberalization of economies in the region is that those state elites, the militaries, the narrow elites of many of the states in the region have obviously benefited from this process of privatization and neoliberal reform. But the other aspect to it is that the Gulf states, the GCC states that I mentioned earlier, have also become very enmeshed in the political economy of the state, of the rest of the region. Okay, Gulf investments, particularly through the 2000s, as oil prices rose, financial surpluses increased, have penetrated much of the rest of the region. So the Gulf is the largest source of foreign direct investment in many, particularly of them, Egypt, Jordan, the states around the Mediterranean area. So with this economic penetration of the region also comes political penetration. So one of the things that has happened under the neoliberal period has been a deepening of the centrality of the Gulf to the Middle East, politics, the political economy of the Middle East. So when we talk about the causes of the Arab uprisings, I think we need to situate it within this totality. It's wrong to isolate the cause of the uprisings to a single factor: authoritarianism, rising food prices, democracy, unemployment, and so forth. All of these factors are very much interrelated and connected to the transformations of class and state that occurred during the neoliberal period, and as I mentioned at the outset, connected to the global crisis that erupted in 2008. When the crisis hit, it hit those countries, particularly in North Africa, quite severely. They were hit by drops in investment, drops in remittance flows from foreign workers overseas, drops in export levels. This crisis was overlaid over the changes that occurred under the neoliberal era. So the Arab uprisings are not separate from the cycle of uprisings that we've seen over the last few years in other parts of the world. Now, the PCD discussion has some discussion around the forms of the counter-revolution that we've seen post or through the last 2 years, and I don't have time to go into detail around that, but I talk about military intervention, the financial aid, increasing loans and attempts of the World Bank and IMF to become involved in the region, the ideological reframing of the uprising, and the political support that we see from the Western states to some Islamist movements in the area. But there's no time to deal with that in detail. But I want to turn to the question of Palestine, and then maybe be able to come back to some of those issues. In the context that I've just set up, the question of Palestine really is central. As you can see, Palestine, of course, is related to, or very much because of Israel's key position in Western hegemony over the region, Palestinian struggle has a vital strategic significance. I think this is important, again, to always frame the way that we approach the Palestinian struggle. It's not just a question of human rights abuses, it's not just a question of the years of dispossession, it's also very much part of the anti-imperialist struggle within the Middle East. Over the last 63 years, since 1947-48, the attempt of Zionism to colonize Palestine has been based upon a fracturing of the Palestinian people. And we can see this in the way that the Palestinian people are described in these different categories. We talk about Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, Palestinians inside Israel, Palestinian refugees, Palestinians in the diaspora. These categories reflect the fragmentation of the people as a whole over the last 63 years. It's been a conscious attempt to destroy the national identity, to destroy a sense, to separate Palestinian people from one another. Now, one of the key moments of this process of fragmentation was the Oslo agreements that were signed in 1993, very much framed at the time by Western states as being peace accords, but I think we can see very clearly now that they were anything but any kind of peace agreement. Now, these Oslo agreements, which is this year is the 20th anniversary of the Oslo Accords, and I think we're going to see a number of events around these Oslo Accords, looking at kind of assessing, analysing the Oslo process this year. But the Oslo agreements, I think it's important to understand these agreements very much connected to this, number one, the fragmentation I've described, but number two, the changes in Palestinian society, particularly in the West Bank. Okay, what the Oslo Accords have relied upon is the creation of a Palestinian class that has very much drawn significant benefits from its relationship with the Israeli occupation. Okay? Within the West Bank, we see a layer of Palestinian society that has formed economic and political relationships with the Israeli military, with the Israeli economy, and benefits from these linkages in kind of keeping the population under control, keeping Palestinian political strategy oriented towards Oslo, towards a two-state solution, towards this kind of negotiated agreement as it's been framed in the last 2 decades. So this is if you like, the social base for the Palestinian Authority. The social base for the Palestinian Authority. This is why the West Bank is quite key to the way Palestinian political strategy is framed, why the leadership of the Palestinian political movement, at least at the official level, is based in the West Bank. So the supine political vision that we see from the Palestinian Authority is based upon this layer of Palestinian society in the West Bank that has built these linkages with the Israeli occupation. So over the last 2 decades, under Oslo, we see what Israel has done is progressively encircled Palestinian towns, encircled Palestinian villages, cut off movement between these areas, and really, if you like, set up a situation akin to remote control. You have an occupation sitting outside of the area. They control all movements of the economy, flow of goods, flows of people. They control the resources, water, electricity, into these isolated Bantustan or fragments within the West Bank. Within these areas, we have the Palestinian Authority and this social layer of Palestinian society that is able to move more freely, that is able to skim off the top of profits that might come from the import and export of goods, and has an interest in this status quo. So what I'm saying here is that it's important we can combat in our political work this illusion of Oslo as being about a peaceful agreement, and also this illusion that Oslo and the peace negotiations are somehow counterposed to force, to military force, that we need to see both Israel's military occupation as well as the negotiation process as being actually two sides of the same coin. There are means to deepen control over Palestinian society. Now, in the Gaza Strip, we see the same process mirrored, although in a slightly different way. Gaza, if you like, has really become an epitome of this kind of Bantusteinization. Israel doesn't have a military presence inside Gaza, but it does control the entry of goods in and out of the area. It controls the airspace, it controls the seas, and at any point it can always attack, and we see this periodically over the last few years, particularly since it came under Hamas administration in 2007. It can periodically launch attacks into the region. So Hamas, through the Oslo years, was very much viewed by much of the Palestinian population as being somehow in opposition to the kind of corruption and political role that the Palestinian Authority under Fatah played in the West Bank. And for that reason, it has had some layer of popular support, particularly at the time of the elections in 2006 and subsequently seizing control over the Gaza Strip. I think we should recognize that's if you like, the social context in which we do see support for Hamas amongst the Palestinian population. But at the same time, we should realize that Hamas has played a role very much against much of the left and against opposing factions in Gaza. The other aspect to Hamas's power is the lucrative and extensive tunnel trade that has developed within Gaza over the last few years. These are estimated to consist up to 1,000 tunnels. They are, of course, well known to the Israelis, but it's through these tunnels that Hamas is able to bring goods in and out. Now, I want to emphasize this system is highly regulated. There is a ministry within Gaza that actually regulates and taxes goods that flow in and out of these tunnels. They have weigh stations that register the goods that come out, see how much they weigh, how much they should be taxed. This tunnel administration is not something that's happening behind the scenes. It's very much embedded in the way that Hamas rules, and it's a source of many profits as a result of these tunnels. It provides an economic base for Hamas rule, and I think we see here, to some extent, if you like, some interest between both Israel and Hamas in this tunnel trade. As long as Hamas is able to keep the Palestinian population under some kind of control within Gaza, this tunnel trade is allowed to continue with periodic attacks, military attacks, periodic destruction of some tunnels. But as long as we see the status quo being maintained, both sides are happy. I think this is important to understand in the context of the Israeli attack on Gaza in November 2012. This attack was very much, it led to the deaths of 161 Gazans, including many civilians. But I think it's important when we look at this particular military intervention in Gaza that we don't frame it in the way that much of the anti-war movement has done, as being a victory for Hamas against Israel, for the reasons that I outlined earlier. That we see this, I think, as part of a periodic struggle between both Hamas and Israel, where Israel has seen the usefulness of Hamas in controlling the Gaza Strip has encouraged particularly the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, Morsi in Egypt, to build a relationship with Hamas in Gaza, and as well as other issues such as to do with testing the Iron Dome system, etc. I don't think we should fall into the trap of saying Israel was wanting to overthrow Hamas, invade the Gaza Strip, and replace it with some other kind of administration, and it was held up from doing that because of Morsi and the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. I think that's a false framing of the attack on Gaza. I've got to wrap up now, so I just want to mention just 4 very quick points around some political tasks for SR. I think we need to show, and this is not meant to be exclusive outline of tasks, but I think we need to show our ongoing support for the Palestine solidarity movement in the UK, particularly the BDS movement. There are many important campaigns that we see taking place in the UK, and partly because of the UK's centrality to imperialism in the region. I think we need to continue to show our opposition to imperialist intervention in the Middle East, and we can do that through Stop the War and other venues. I think we need to continue solidarity with struggles, particularly in Egypt and Tunisia, where there are ongoing mass struggles against the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, these, I think, are important to build some practical links and solidarity with. And finally, I think there's some important contributions we can make to the wider political debates about the Middle East that tries to situate it within this regional context and not just focus very much on individual nation states and what's going on individually in the area. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Adam.